So I'm trying to make this a channel that criticizes everybody on the political spectrum. Doesn't matter where you are. No one is safe. No one is safe from me. I'm crazy. Um, I haven't really talked about it yet, but I would generally describe myself as pretty far left or like revolutionary socialist area of the left, more than like the liberal Democrat part of the left. Although, as I'm sure you've already seen if you've watched my other videos, I'm pretty all over the place as far as things go. Not really predictable on that front. So one thing I wanted to do today was I wanted to show you guys some socialist constitutionalism, because one thing that socialists don't do a lot of is they don't talk a lot about institutions. I said before that one of my key focuses is the institutional approach to government, like who makes the decisions and how they make the decisions, rather than just my particular opinion on what decision those people should make, what decision would be best for them to make, right? So there's not a lot of focus on that from within the socialist camp. There's also just generally a lot of pushback among socialists to the idea, even the abstract idea, of just saying what socialism should be. Like, I don't know how they make that work in their head. I do know how they make that work in their head, but they're wrong. They're wrong too. Um, I think that we absolutely should try to articulate what not capitalism would be, instead of just criticizing capitalism without proposing any one clear alternative, so that we can like have a good open-ended broad coalition of a movement of people who all stand behind the word socialism, which now means nothing in particular because we've refused to give it clear definition. Um, so yeah, I'm definitely pro prefiguration. This is a strongly pro prefiguration thing. So I commend both of these groups I'm going to talk about today. These are two different socialist parties I'm going to talk about today. I commend both of them for at least putting forward some kind of a proposal. Although, because both of them are on this like far left dogma against prefiguration, and they've had these conversations and dialogues within their own circle, both of them are making a conscious effort to like put a bunch of asterisks and addendums at the beginning of their proposal that say things like, well, we know we can't, work out all of the details of a future society, and it'd be utopian to think that we would know absolutely everything that's going to happen in the future, and different contexts, different countries require different circumstances, require different contexts, and that's gonna change the way things operate. Other vague sorts of like asterisks to put on the concept of proposing what the world should be like, right? But once they're done with their hand wringing, once they're done with all their addendums that they have to do, they get to the juicy bit, which is actually saying what they want the institutions to be. Now, I'm not going to focus at all on what they say about the economy or any of that, partly because I largely agree with some of what they say about the economy, but also partly because that's just a whole other video, right? This is about the democratic institutions that they propose. These are organizations that often want to have a revolution, often want to overthrow the government and install a new state. It is extremely important, if you're going to advocate something like that, that the state that you're creating have a constitution of some sort and have a clear guideline of what kind of legal operating procedures it's going to operate under once you've established that new government. So these are two different groups that have kind of tried to do that, right? One of them is the Revolutionary Communist Party of America, and the other one is the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I'm going to start with the Party for Socialism and Liberation's proposal. So the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I won't bore you with all of it here, but they spend a long time talking about uh, the disenfranchisement of urban voters through things like the Electoral College and the Senate and even our state senates, that are designed to give more power to rural areas because they're less populated, but they still get so many representatives. If you're the Senate, for example, gets 2 representatives from any state, no matter what. So even if that state is less populated, they still get representatives. So a lot of times that means that there is a counter majoritarian force happening within the Senate, where a majority of voters will want something, but it won't get done because a majority of politicians elected to the Senate do not agree with the majority of voters. Legitimate criticism, I think, in a lot of ways. Um, I don't love the dismissal of rural areas. They seem to have a very strong belief that urban equals progress. They point out that 80% of the world's population lives in urban areas. They seem to very strongly believe that urban equals progress, rural equals past. And I'm not sure that I fully agree with that. That's probably its own video. But they're talking about getting rid of those counter-democratic institutions and building what you might call a populist government. A government that is more directly democratic, not in the sense of voting on every issue, but just in the sense of majority rules with fewer barriers to majority rule, which in a lot of ways I'm in favor of. But listen to some of the things that they are willing to tolerate outside of that, right? So, yeah, let's start with this. So, they want to abolish the Senate, right? They want to replace it with what's called the Assembly of Oppressed Nations, which is, I think, an odd choice. I feel like it would have been wiser to just say abolish the Senate and then just get rid of it, right? Just get rid of it completely. There's no need to replace it. But they decided to replace it with the Assembly of Oppressed Nations. Let me see here. They say the U.S. capitalist class has secured its wealth and domination over society by the theft of the lands of the indigenous peoples and nations of North America, and by the enslavement and subsequent super oppression. We're dealing with super oppression in this one, boys, and exploitation of African Americans. Institutions of racism were constructed to enforce this system and ensure the ongoing disenfranchisement and marginalization of tens of millions of people. To correct this historic injustice and to guarantee the full unity of the working class on the basis of genuine equality, the Assembly of Oppressed Nations will function as a second chamber. It will consist of delegates from oppressed nationalities and peoples. Okay. How on earth does that work? How does that function? Um, we're talking about an assembly of minorities, basically. That's what they're calling for here, and it seems like specifically they've chosen indigenous people and black people, which I feel like is already a contentious start, right? Because by choosing indigenous people and black people, you're now playing oppression Olympics. Because now, if you're gay, you don't get to be a part of the minorities assembly. If you're a woman, you don't get to be a part of the minorities assembly. I mean, you do if you're black, but you know what I mean? So they've created an opportunity for people to have like an oppression Olympics based debate over this. So that's first of all. Second of all, indigenous people do often have like autonomous rights within their territories or lands, and that's a pretty significant demand of indigenous struggle, is for more autonomy and control over their own land and of self-determination of indigenous regions, right? um, you'll see in a moment that in general socialists are not big fans of local areas self-determining or making decisions for themselves and guiding their own direction. They're generally in favor of the majority ruling no matter what. And that means that if the majority of people in the United States at large say something goes, then the minority of people that are indigenous people on a given piece of land would lose out to that vote. So I don't know how they would make that work, right? That feels like a deep tension there between the socialist desire to say that the solution to every problem is through simple majority, the people rule, get rid of all these minoritarian checks on the tyranny of the majority. Those were all racist anyways. Let's get rid of those. How does that work with indigenous self-determination? But then also, how do you determine who is a part of an oppressed nationality? Like, are we going up to people with skin blotches and being like, are you black enough to be a part of this new institution that we've constructed? Are we doing DNA tests to see if they have like slavery in their ancestry? If it is it self-identification? Because you just know if it's self-identification, you're immediately going to have a problem with like a bunch of reactionaries being like, well, I identify as black. Why shouldn't I be a part of the nation of oppressed people? So I think this is a really stupid idea. And I don't know how it's possible that this idea made it into the actual book and wasn't like, presumably they had a discussion as an organization about all of these proposals. This is a party. This is the Party for Socialism and Liberation. This isn't like one author. You would think somebody would say, excuse me, how do we determine who is indigenous enough to be a part of this council? And then there would be a big fight, and then eventually they'd be like, you know what, this is too contentious. Let's leave this out of like the manifesto or whatever. We can work out the details of this in our own time. So that's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to point out is a little bit farther up here. The first chamber will be the National People's Assembly, conforming loosely to the current House of Representatives. So that's the popular Democratic branch. So they like that branch, right? The National People's Assembly will consist of delegates elected from local election districts and from mass organizations representing various sectors in society: labor unions, women's organization, youth, etc. It will need to be numerically much larger than the current 435-member House of Representatives in order to guarantee adequate representation from all urban regions, smaller towns, and rural areas. Currently, there is about one representative in Congress for every 750,000 citizens in the country. This is an absurdly small number for democracy. For instance, in Cuba, there is one member of parliament for every 20,000 citizens. Now, I want to say, first of all, that I agree wholeheartedly with this criticism. The House of Representatives is way too small. There are not enough members, and it does suck that they are representing 750,000 citizens on average. And that's on average, by the way. It actually differs. There's inequality of representation within Congress. So some people are representing like, I think the maximum was like 1.5 million citizens being represented, and then the minimum was much lower as well because there's a big range. So depending on where you are in the country and who your congressperson is, when you call your congressperson, you might be one of a million people giving them that phone call today. Or at least, according to this, one of 750,000 people giving them that phone call today. Of course, that's not going to be a representative in any meaningful sense. You can't talk to them. You can't access them. They are as distant from you as a celebrity that you watch on TV. They're not a person to you. They're an image of a person. And I think that's deeply dangerous, and I think we need to do something about that. I think that's a real problem, so I'm glad they point that out. One thing I want to note, though, is the country they use as a comparison is in Cuba. You know, obviously they chose a socialist country, makes sense. In Cuba, there is one member of parliament for every 20,000 citizens. Cuba, I looked it up, has a population of 11.21 million people. The United States has a population of 333 million people because we're huge. We're so much bigger than Cuba, and no one talks about how enormous of a nation the United States is. Cuba is about 9 or 10 New Hampshires in size, and the United States is about 330 New Hampshires in size. For reference, for all of my New Hampshire people, it's a huge difference, in scale, right? Cuba is about 3.3% of the population of the US. Of course, they're going to have fewer people per representative. And part of the problem that gets always brought up with the idea of expanding the House of Representatives is how can you have that many people rationally functioning as a decision-making body? If you wanted to have as many representatives, enough representatives to have the same proportion as Cuba, you would have to have more than 1,000 people in the House of Representatives. And you can't fit them in one room. They can't talk. They can't deliberate. They can't form coalitions well enough. It doesn't function as a decision-making body when it's that enormous. And that is also a problem, right? And you know what the solution to both of those problems is? You know what would allow us to have, quote-unquote, an expanded House of Representatives and not have a bloated number of people in the House of Representatives? Having a smaller country. Having a smaller country would help with that. So, again, I say, we need secession. We need a smaller country. It really is a root of a lot of the problems we're having come from the fact that we're a big country, and we could have a stronger democracy if we were it. So that's my secession soapbox, right? So let me go down to the next section here. Regional and local affairs will be managed by either a regional people's assembly for larger urbanized regions or a local people's assembly for smaller cities, towns, and rural areas. Unlike the undemocratic and ineffective federal system, in the centralized socialist system, laws will be universally applied throughout the country. So this is something that runs throughout all of this socialist literature, is they want to move to a unitary system. It actually, credit to them, unlike a lot of liberals, they explicitly say it. I think it's up here. They say unitary system. Where is it? National administrative. Well, maybe I don't know where it is. But they do. They say that we should move to a unitary system of government. The problem with what they say then, right, is that they claim to care about having devolved power, but what does that actually mean in practice, right? What does it mean to devolve power down to regions and local governments without a system of federalism of some kind? It means that if the central government feels like it and wants to give power to lower level governments, they can for practical purposes. It's a delegation of management. It's like being the boss of a company and giving some responsibilities down to middle managers. It is not the same as vesting actual decision-making power and autonomy in local regions and communities, which brings me back again to my oppressed peoples thing. How does this work that you want simultaneously, as an activist, you want Black communities to hopefully have more of control over themselves. You definitely want Indigenous self-determination because Indigenous people make that an explicit goal of their social movements. You want that, but you also want to undermine that completely by calling for a total national system in a country that is majority white. The oppressed peoples will not be better off in a system where their local regions, local governments do not have decision-making authority actually legally vested in them, and it can instead be granted to them or taken away from them at the will of a federal majority. So I don't trust this. Okay. Um, so yeah, these are some institutional differences I have with a lot of socialists. Right. I'm not super comfortable with a lot of this majoritarianism. I like some of it. Like I feel like probably we could do away with like the electoral college probably. Although I recently heard a case from the Green Party guy I had on as a guest that maybe I'm thinking of it in the wrong sort of a way. Um, but I do generally think that systems that try to give, let's say, a rural minority increased voting power in centralized elections and in central decision making organizations like the federal government. I think that those systems I like a lot less than systems that just give decision making power more directly to cities and to rural areas and allow them to diverge, allow them to go their own way, allow them to make decisions for themselves. I think there's a big difference between giving the voting rights of a rural voter more power in a national system of government and giving rural areas more power to self determine from a national government. So that's a distinction I would probably make. So that's it for the Party for Socialism and Liberation's constitution. The next one I want to look at is the Revolutionary Communist Party constitution. One thing that I do kind of like about the Revolutionary Communist Party's proposals is that they do talk very explicitly about the fact that they believe their organization should be a constitutionally bound provisional government. I think that when people on the socialist left talk about revolution, it becomes clear that the primary goal for them is the seizure of power from the current government by a group that calls itself socialists, a group that say we are the good guys, we're the socialists, right? Um, Rather than just creating new institutions, creating a new system of government that you think is the right system of government within your socialist movement, such that you can compete with the existing government and then replace them. I think that the goal should always be to show that we can do things better. It should be constructive. It should be that we know how to do things better more than just the seizure of power. Because I think that if you focus on and emphasize the seizure of power above all else, then you end up sacrificing a lot of the principles that are necessary to create a sustainable democratic government that can actually allow your system to thrive into the future. So let's look at some of what they propose for their government. So this is the central legislature. This is their version of a House of Representatives. This is their version of a central lawmaking body. They're also pretty populist in a lot of ways, but that's not really what I want to talk about with the Revolutionary Communist Party. What I want to talk about here is how they decide who makes up their central legislative body. Shall be organized and conducted in accordance with provisions and procedures established by the legislature, or in the case of the first elected legislature in the new Socialist Republic of North America, by the Provisional Governing Council. That's the provisional government I told you about earlier. But the following shall apply in the voting for the central legislature. 20% of the total seats shall be determined through votes cast by the organs of government at workplaces, neighborhoods, educational institutions, and other basic institutions of society. These organs of government shall themselves be elected by popular vote. So that's an interesting one. I don't have anything strong to say about that one because it's unique. It's a unique institutional idea. The idea is that they're empowering civil society organizations within their central government by delegating 20% of the governing body to those organizations. They're saying, hey, the people at their workplaces, the people in neighborhoods, the people in schools, they're making democratic decisions about those individual organizations, and then representatives from those organizations are going to move up to the higher levels of government. There's something to that. I'm not going to criticize that too harshly. It's not what I'm here to talk about today. 20% of the total seats shall be determined through votes cast by the organs of government in the local areas and regions, including any autonomous regions and autonomous areas that may be established. These organs of government shall also be elected by popular vote. So that is almost a Senate, kind of, right? Or something like that, right? They're saying that 20% of the decision-making body, it's not a separate decision-making body like the Senate, but 20% of this Congress is going to be determined by autonomous regions and local areas. So they're talking about a local check. They're talking about a check on the majority by having 20% of their basic legal governing body be made up of representatives from these local areas. So maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but it's definitely counter-majoritarian in a way that resembles the original American Constitution, which, as you saw before, many socialists are very critical of. The Party for Socialism and Liberation was very critical of it. 30% of the total seats shall be determined through votes cast through direct popular election, with voting to be conducted by districts established by the central legislature, or, in the case of the first elected legislature, by the Provisional Governing Council. For the purpose of electing this legislature, everyone eligible to vote and to serve in the legislature may stand for election in this process. So they're saying 30% of the seats on this governing body will be elected normally. Basically, that's what they're saying. This is a normal election where normal voters can elect whoever, right? And then 30% of the total seats shall be also determined by votes cast through direct popular election conducted by districts in the same manner and with the same eligibility requirements as described in the paragraph above, with the difference that in this process, those standing for the election will have been recommended by a nominating council established and led by the Revolutionary Communist Party. So, I don't love that part. I don't love that part. Here, I'll read the rest of it first. It shall be the general orientation of this council and of the party in establishing and leading it that wherever and whenever feasible, more than one group of candidates shall be nominated, and that those nominated reflect a diversity of views within the overall framework of the principles and objectives set forth in the preamble and elsewhere in this Constitution. So, in other words, 30% are going to be communists, guaranteed, right? 30% are going to be voted normally. 20% are going to be voted normally, but from specific local regions to give them a leg up, give them more autonomy. 20% are going to be determined through like our institutions, our schools, and our workplaces and our neighborhoods, which would be democratically organized in a socialist society, right? And the remaining 30% just will also be voted on directly, but they're all going to be communists. They're all going to be nominated directly by the Revolutionary Communist Party. To me, this feels a bit insecure. To me, this feels a little bit like we're a little bit afraid that after our socialist or communist revolution, right? After we have a communist revolution and we've installed a communist government and we make it a democracy, right? We're a little bit afraid that people aren't going to elect enough communists into government. So we have to make sure at least 30% of the government is automatically communist, just in case. Just in case they're not electing enough communists on their own post-revolution. That feels like they're not confident enough in the ability of their ideas to actually win elections in the society that they just freshly created. So they instead have to insecurely come up with a way of guaranteeing them seats. So I don't really trust that. So do you see how there's a lot of problems on an institutional level? A lot of very obvious, like common sense, surface level problems, I think, with the institutional proposals put forward by these socialist organizations. And these socialist organizations are, as far as I can tell, the cream of the crop insofar as they are willing to actually propose something. Uh, the vast majority of them refrain from making committed proposals, specifically, I think, probably so that this doesn't happen, so that they don't get owned on the internet for having bad ideas. I mean, it's not that they have their own philosophical reasons for it, but I think it does function as a protective sort of a thing, because if you never believe anything specific, you can never be criticized. And I think that's a position that has been useful for a lot of the left for a long time in America. I think, like the 90s, for example, I'm thinking of the grungy sort of, adult animation MTV era. I feel like there was a lot of this energy of like, the system is broken, man, but also there is nothing we're going to do to fix it or change it or replace it in any way. We're not going to do absolutely anything because it's just broken and that's just the way it is. And society sucks and humanity sucks and that's just the world. And I don't think that attitude is very constructive at all. I think that we've allowed the left to be an organization that spends the majority of its time talking about how the system sucks and capitalism sucks and everything's capitalism's fault. But they don't spend a significant amount of time saying how they'll fix it. That's part of the reason I did my video on banning advertising as well, was because there's a ton of people who will talk all the time about how everything is capitalism's fault, right? So addictive social media, it's because of our capitalist society, man, and like all these different celebrities sort of protecting their brand image, and everything we do in the modern day on social media, we're all kind of micro celebrities now, and so we act in protection of our brand image instead of acting on our own accord. And so in every way possible, we are trying to make money instead of just being a person. They criticize that a ton. They're like, the real problem here is capitalism. But then when you go to their socialist proposals, that is to say, what they think we should do instead, the actual clarity is not there. And in fact, in some of the socialist proposals, they have markets still being very much a thing that is open and privately controlled in a lot of ways for industries like consumer goods and for a lot of the industries that we're criticizing. So I don't think it makes sense to, on one hand, be very, very mad about addictive social media, but then not have any clear guidelines for how we create a less addictive social media, for how we move forward, for how we do something else, something better. It's worthless to criticize society if you're not actually suggesting what we should do instead. And kudos to these guys for trying to suggest something, but I think we can do better.